Hi, Michael Force here again with Rise Digital Marketing Mastery Course, lesson number 3 here, Persuading for Profit, how to sell with psychology, how to use psychology to sell. Now, of course, there's a darker side of that. You can get into manipulation and all these other kind of things, but we're not really going to be so much talking about marketing. Is at some core a certain form of manipulation when it comes to think about commercials and getting people to act and to respond and to buy your product or see your solution to their problem in a whole different way. Marketing is extremely powerful and you can use it in a lot of different ways, but psychologically there's a whole strategy and formula behind it that can really get people to buy, and it's incredibly powerful. So I'm going to walk you through that here in lesson number 3, Persuading for Profit, and let's dig in and jump into lesson number 3. I'll see you on the inside. Hello, this is Michael Force. Welcome to Lesson 3, Persuading for Profit, How to Sell with Psychology, part of the Rise Digital Marketing Mastery course. Let's dive in here. Now, in this particular section, we're going to be diving really deep into marketing psychology. And in the next few sessions, we'll really open our eyes as well as our minds to the intricacies and subtleties of how the human mind works, of how it goes about making decisions, and ultimately, about how it decides to purchase things from you. Now, this is lesson 3, why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. So as we learned, human psychology is simply not based on rationality. From our own internal perspectives, it may appear to us that our decisions and actions are completely rational. Meanwhile, though, reality tells us otherwise. Modern science shows us that our thinking, our decisions, and our actions are not based on rationality. Other human beings always doing things for their own reasons, never for your reasons, and rarely are these reasons ever rational. To explore this idea further, we're going to learn about some interesting models that some researchers and scientists have created in order to really help us understand this irrational human being. And throughout this program, you're going to hear me use the term human chimpanzee several times because in reality, in most of our behaviors, thinking, and emotional responses, we really are acting like overgrown, highly intelligent chimpanzees. Jared Diamond, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, wrote a book before that one called it The Third Chimpanzee. And in this book, he said there are basically 3 different categories of chimpanzees. There are regular, good old chimpanzees. Then there are the bonobos, a sort of quasi-chimp, which many call the pygmy chimp, since it looks like a chimp but behaves very differently. Finally, and yes, you've guessed it, there are the humans, the third chimpanzee. This book goes on to explain that all 3 types diverged from a common ancestor some several billion years ago, and that we actually have lots in common, much more so than we think. Now, what's really become fashionable recently is that whenever we look at those aspects of our behavior we don't like, such as violence, backstabbing, political intrigues, society, selfishness, etc., we just kind of say, yeah, but that's just a remnant of our evolutionary past. That's the animal inside of us. That's the bonobo and the chimp. But we don't realize that everything we love and treasure about being human, things like love, warmth, selflessness, generosity, sacrifice, taking care of our family, and having the motivation to achieve things, that all of these are rooted in our animal past. And we have these things in common with the other 2 types of chimpanzees as well. Now, when it comes to our intelligent minds, they obviously have other mechanisms in them that the other type of chimpanzees don't have. And one of the real interesting powers of our minds is the power to confabulate, which is sort of like a subconscious process of justifying and rationalizing our thinking, decisions, and actions, which fool us into thinking that we are rational. But if you step outside of our own minds for just a quick second and look at other human beings, especially at how they behave, you will clearly see that there is definitely something going on that is far from rationality and logic. Now, as with everything else in life, our psychology is rooted in our past. Great progress has been made decoding human psychology and behavior over the past few decades, and the more we look for evolutionary drivers of our psychological mechanisms, the more we find them. For instance, if you want to look for the motivating factors behind most of your thoughts, feelings, and actions, you're going to find things like survival, reproduction, and status. There's a game-changing field that's been quickly emerging onto the public scene in the last couple of decades, and it's called evolutionary psychology. Now, to illustrate the profound effect that evolution is having in general, no matter where you are, no matter what your belief system is and how you look at the world, you will find that most fields of knowledge, whether scientific, technical, religious, practical, spiritual, or whatever, are all incorporating some aspects of evolution into their models, simply because of the overwhelming supporting evidence that it's provided us. But even more than this, and behind all of the success in evolution, we've found certain common denominators as far as our core psychological motivators, and these are survival, reproduction, and social status. Basically staying alive, having sex, and gaining status. To us, that's the good life. And as Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner and self-made billionaire, likes to say, whenever he looks hard enough behind any human behavior not making any sense to him, he finds incentives. He finds something going on to explain it, something that's driving them. It may not be obvious at first, but the more you study, the more you will see that there are certain common denominators. And as it turns out, as the evolutionary psychologists, biologists, and behaviorists keep looking closer, they realize that so much is related to sex and reproduction that is truly mind-boggling. Now, in fact, as I was reading the studies of one of these evolutionary scientists, they took it as a rule of thumb that whenever they observe anything strange on an animal that makes no sense to them at all, whether it's a physical part on a body or some sort of action conducted, they start to look to sexuality and reproduction as a possibility, and it all starts to make sense at that point. Think of giant antlers on an elk that require a tremendous amount of calories and work to grow. Or think of the long feathers on the tail of a peacock that make it very susceptible to being caught by predators. There are also very hard to grow and take care of, and along with their bright colors, end up making them very visible to predators, as I said. So what's the logic behind these? Well, you'll see that what's usually going on is that the particular aspect or thing was attractive to members of the opposite sex. So it got a little bit exaggerated, and slightly longer peacock feathers, which was attractive to the female peacock, got longer and longer and longer. Now you've got peacocks with these dizzying 4, 5, 6 foot long feathers that make these incredible, mind-blowing displays as a result of evolution. Now, regarding another kind of layer that runs over survival and production is this thing called social status. And the more we look in the human being and in the human chimp, the more we find within it a very political and status-orientated animal, and for good reason. Being status-orientated, or in other words, liking where you fit in the social hierarchy, was very good for pack cohesion, since it kept the group together and made sure that every member behaved in a way that allowed them to succeed as a group. And because we humans began evolving in groups of 100 to 150, this meant we knew everyone in our group and where we stood. This also meant that we got a lot of security from our status within the group, and as a result, we evolved over long periods of time to really become orientated toward status. Now, it must be mentioned that social status is really getting a bad rap right now. In this postmodern age, these idealistic mindsets are showing up and saying that the idea of social status and hierarchy is obsolete, that we should no longer organize ourselves into status hierarchies because that's animal stuff, and that's just not right and not good. Well, it turns out that this leaning toward status is what we do. We humans organize ourselves into status hierarchies, and we keep on doing it. Keep on organizing some type of social hierarchy into group structures, whether a group contains 2 members or 2 million members. And there simply doesn't look like there's anything we can do about it, removing the status orientation in our society. So saying that it's wrong or bad, or pretending that our social status doesn't exist, from my experience, will not make it go away. Instead, it will just make us kind of crazy and make us behave completely out of touch with reality. Now, with that being said, I think that we humans can transcend this drive to status and mold it into something that healthfully, and where the social hierarchy doesn't marginalize or oppress others, and where it can become based on helping others develop and grow. Now, to sum up the most important points to recap and understand is that behind most of our thoughts, feelings, and actions, you will find that survival, reproduction, and status make up our core motivating factors that drive us to get certain things and to avoid losing them. Today we clearly see that we humans have 3 different brains in one. The scientist Dr. Paul MacLean created a model that he calls the triune brain. And in the triune brain, he explains we have 3 parts. The first is an old reptilian brain, which is the little ball at the top of our spinal cord and at the back of our brain. Then we have the brainstem, which grew to what's called the mammal, or emotional brain. And finally, around the stem grew the cortex, or the thinking brain. So inside of us right now, we have a reptile, a mammal, and a thinker. However, the unique challenge is that these 3 brains are just not very well integrated, and the older brains seem to rule the newer. So even though we walk around thinking that it's our logical brain, our thinking brain that's in control, it's usually our emotional brain, and in many cases, our reptilian brain that controls us. Now, it's interesting to point out that the reptilian, mammal, and thinking brain are also correspond to the physical, emotional, and rational, or mental realities of the world. First grew the reptilian brain to interact with the physical world in order to eat, reproduce, and survive. Then grew the mammal, or the emotional brain, which allowed us to bond with others and group together in herds and flocks, so forth, to care for the young and raise them to adulthood. And this we share with all other mammals. Now, on top of the emotional brain grew the thinking brain, and this allowed us to reflect on ourselves, to have an acute awareness of life, and to use symbols and concepts for communication with the world around us. This thinking brain also helped us create logic, which allowed us to learn from the past, to analyze the present, and to predict the future. So 3 different levels, 3 different brains, and 3 different realms that we live in: the physical, emotional, and the logical. However, these 3 brains don't seem to communicate very well with one another, even though they're organized to run as one. So, what happens? When the reptilian brain gets triggered, in other words, when we're facing a situation we perceive as dangerous, we feel lots of fear. Or when there's a meeting opportunity in front of us, we go right back into the flight or fight brain, and we begin behaving like an animal. Or many folks tend to be really centered in the mammalian brain and are so concerned with what other people think of them, so worried about trying to get approval or loving the other people around them, that they don't use their logical minds to make rational decisions that can help them get ahead in a complex information environment. In a nutshell, most people spend most of their time living in the reptile and mammal worlds. The real bottom line here is that we humans are built and wired for a time that doesn't exist anymore. The modern environment has changed so dramatically from our original environment. We have become homo technologists, living inside of a self-built human zoo. Yet our inner wiring hasn't changed much at all. We're still running around, thinking and acting according to reptile and mammal brains within us. From the beginning, we have evolved in environments where we started living out in the open, and we eventually started living in places like caves, trees, and things like that. But essentially, we didn't have modern apartment buildings and dwellings where we could close and lock the door, cutting ourselves off from the external world. We basically live in a very different environment, which has nothing to do with nature anymore. Now, Desmond Morris wrote a very interesting book called The Naked Ape, where he analyzed humans as just another ape. And guess what he found? Well, we tend to behave most of the time just like other apes. After The Naked Ape, Morris wrote another book called The Human Zoo. And in it, he suggested that when you take animals and put them inside the zoo, they stop behaving like themselves because they don't have their environment anymore. This leads them to severe apathy and makes them depressed and lethargic, kind of just like laying there in their own feces all day. Well, it turns out humans do the same thing, only we built our own zoo and we call it our homes, towns, and cities. And we go in, lock ourselves into our homes every night, and then start getting depressed and apathetic, becoming lethargic and obese. We keep telling ourselves that there's something really wrong, but we never tie it back to the fact that we have now put ourselves inside the human zoo. that we have cut ourselves off from the outside. And it's absolutely crucial for us to remember that our own inner wiring is for living outside, not in the current zoo that we have put ourselves in. This all leads to the reality that we don't make decisions logically, that we make decisions unconsciously and with our own animal, within the mammal and reptile brains. To us, the process of making a decision appears to be rational, so we assume that it appears most decisions are made consciously. However, decisions are made on an unconscious level, and then those decisions are confabulated, meaning rationalized with the conscious mind, as we have learned. And to make things worse, we are completely overwhelmed by communications and choices. Jack Trout said in the West, one of the best positioning, that live in the world's first over-communicated society. That we live in the world's first over-communicated society. He said that back in 1980, by the way, 3 decades and a half ago, let that roll around in your head for a minute, the level of choice we have today is literally immobilizing us, and the average person has essentially no hope of silencing the ever-increasing noise. We are dramatically over-communicated, and we are absolutely inundated with communication, distractions, and all kinds of other junk. The choices we have are also completely immobilizing us. It's gone way beyond having just a few choices, that now we're completely immobilized by choice. There are just way too many of them. Many of us don't understand that all of our time, effort, and attention is being taken by machines, by the internet, and by others, and so that we're so overwhelmed that this is actually now becoming the normality. It's what we're getting accustomed to. Another important psychological insight to succeed in marketing is that humans are twice as motivated to avoid pain as we are to get pleasure. A wide variety of studies have shown that we humans will pay twice as much to avoid pain as we will to get pleasure. The problem, or fear, or pain aspect of what you sell is twice as important as the pleasure aspect. So why would this be? Why would we humans be twice as motivated to avoid pain as we are to get pleasure? Well, the simple explanation is probably that in the environment we evolved in, something bad happened. It was simply game over. If we didn't escape from the saber-toothed tiger that was after us, we died. If we didn't reproduce, our genes didn't make it to the next generation, and our entire lineage would disappear. So we are very motivated to avoid what you might call loss, or pain, or problems, or failure. And again, we're about twice as motivated to avoid these as we are to get to desire or pleasure. But this doesn't mean that pleasure and desire don't motivate us, because they do. It just means that avoiding pain and problems and fears and anxiety and worry is twice as motivating as acquiring a want, desire, or pleasure. This concept is just so important to really take in and to absorb when conducting marketing. My experience is that the most inexperienced marketers will constantly try to sell those benefits that are positive. They'll try to sell the pleasure or the good rather than showing how their product or service will help solve problems a customer may have, how it will rid the customer of certain fears, and how it will make all that pain go away. Also, lots of people in this day and age tend to avoid paying attention to the negative. They are so focused on positive thinking and keep thinking to themselves, I'm just going to think about this positively. I'm not going to think about all that bad stuff. This leads to, of course, avoiding to even look at any pain, which will only make the pain worse in the end anyways. And when we avoid looking at things and they get worse, we start getting trapped into a cycle of avoidance, repression, and doing anything that ends up being so much more difficult for us. So remember, we are twice as motivated to avoid pain as we are to get pleasure. And it's absolutely imperative that we use this in our marketing and use it when communicating with prospects and getting customers for our business. When we have a need, the entire process behind our thoughts and decisions change. A person who is experiencing a need, whether it's a craving, a desire, or fear, becomes an entirely different animal. Basically, when we're under the extreme pressure of a need, we become single-minded in our quest to satisfy. So the general rule of thumb here is the stronger the need, the more we behave like a mindless animal. And if the need gets so strong that it pushes those evolutionary buttons of survival, reproduction, or status, and we see the opportunity to acquire or avoid losing our survival, reproduction, or status, then we act in complete desperation. The point is that when a human being goes from a neutral state of no need to the charged state of in great need, the way that our minds, emotions, and bodies work will drastically change. For example, think about when you've had a really healthy and satisfying meal you like. You probably devoured that meal and really enjoyed it. An hour later, you probably felt happy, full, and satisfied. Now, in relation to the food you ate, what's your thinking? What's your feeling? What's your behavior? Well, when you've just eaten and you're completely satisfied, you're probably optimistic that you're going to get more food in the future. You're probably telling yourself, yeah, I feel really happy and healthy right now. I need to eat more meals like that in the future. I'm going to do all I can to avoid all the other crap I usually eat. Hey, maybe it's a good time to start using those free gym exercises visits I won the other day. Yeah, that sounds like a plan. Okay, now contrast that with a time in your life when you remember not having anything to eat all day. Maybe you didn't have a chance to eat from the time you woke up until the time you got home late at night. Maybe you got really busy or were traveling somewhere and got stranded. The point is, you went all day without food. Now think about how you feel about food and your relationship to it. When you're really hungry, all of your thoughts and logic and strategic long-term thinking and health, they fly out the window. And all that comes in is, I want food now. In fact, this is probably one of the reasons why we eat so much junk food. It's because we wait until we get hungry before we choose what we're going to eat, and it turns out that eating and survival are very close related things. So, this extreme hunger, this presence of a dire need, pushes the survival button inside of us. When it gets too strong and then we stop behaving like a rational human being and start behaving like a hungry animal that will do anything to get food. Humans also tend to get extremely cranky and irritable when hungry, and honestly get so much more animal-like when they're hungry. I know I do. Another important point is that when humans are very bad at figuring out how much things are worth, money, value, and prices are very confusing to humans. We are constantly looking for cues, criteria, and comparisons to understand how much products and services are worth. The invention of money was a beautiful moment in our evolution as humans, but it was also a very challenging moment. When we created money, it allowed us to exchange one thing for another extremely quickly and easily. If you had a goat you wanted to trade for 2 axes and a fishing net, well, you probably would have had a very hard time succeeding a few thousand years ago. But this was before we had money, where to do something like that, we had to find people with different types of things and do multiple trades. And even with all of this, it was still highly unlikely that you were going to find someone that had exactly what you wanted in exchange for your goat. But now, you just sell your goat and use that money to get the axes and the fishing net. Such a smooth and simple process with money. Or is it? Over the course of our history, the medium of money changed from gold and silver. It changed from shells and wine. It changed from grain and other material things that actually had real value when used by themselves. And now it has changed to coins and paper bills. Now, that little leap really screwed a lot of people up because they couldn't really think about what they could do with the coins and paper bills. The idea of money became even more abstract, and after that it became numbers on a screen or the things you look at inside of a computer screen. Today, money is very abstract, and most humans just can't even deal with it. We hear that the value of their currency is going up and down in relationship to other currencies. We hear that we have nothing that backs our currency anymore, that's just agreeing to use it. We just close our eyes and shake our heads and say, I can't deal with this. So number one, we humans think that money is value. Number two, we don't know how to compare the value of things to each other because all we can think of is how much they are worth in terms of money, which has no real value. And three, when we get confused, we just kind of start shutting down. We put our heads in the sand and avoid wanting to think about it anymore. And all of this adds up to prospective customers who need clarity. So as a professional marketer, as someone who wants to go out there and start getting customers for their business, you cannot hope to cut through all this inner and outer noise without some focus. You must know what exactly you're offering. You must know what it's for and what the benefit is. Then you must present it to the irrational human mind, the irrational human chimp. If you don't do this, you might as well not even begin. Because, again, you're dealing with too many layers of challenge. You're dealing with the irrational human mind and the confusion around money and value. You're dealing with customers and prospects that are immobile and have a huge inability to focus because we have too many distractions, choices, and interruptions. You're dealing with humans that live in an environment that's so alien to the one we evolved in and which has screwed up so many other ways. You're also dealing with humans who need some clarity. Therefore, you must be super focused. You must understand that all this and human and understand exactly what you're offering. You must understand who you're talking to, where to find them, what the benefits are, and how it helps them avoid pain. You must then understand how to present all of this to the irrational part of the human mind. Because again, if you're going to do your job as a business person and marketer, then you're finding people who are actually in need. And you're not just trying to sell whatever you offer to some random people. So again, they're in a different mind frame. You've got to present it in the irrational human mind in a way that makes sense to them, that allows them to buy, to enjoy consuming, to make a good decision and to feel good about it. And if you don't do this, then you might as well not even start. So let's do a quick exercise, appealing to the irrational human. Humans are irrational in most of their decisions, communications, and behaviors, as we said, which is the result of irrational forces driving us. To succeed in marketing, you must abandon logic and begin considering and appealing to the irrational motives in drivers hiding the shadows of human psychology. So take a few minutes and answer these questions. When have you expected people to buy your products or services simply because it was the logical choice or the logical thing to do? When have you believed that if you offered a better product, people would buy it? How can you begin appealing to the irrational motivators that are really driving most human thought, communication, and behavior? Go ahead and answer those questions, and I will see you in the next lesson. Again, this is Michael Force, and we'll see you there. Take care.